The colony ship GSS Hearthstone drifted through the black void of space like a steel whale swimming through an ocean of stars, carrying 12,000 human souls toward a new world in the Valen Reach, a stretch of space that had only recently been opened for settlement by the Galactic Concord, the great alliance of 34 spacefaring species that had kept a fragile peace for nearly 2 centuries. Among those 12,000 were 3,400 children, and it was the children that fascinated Ambassador Corus Vaughn more than anything else aboard this vessel. Corus Vaughn was Delvari, a tall insectoid creature with 4 arms and eyes like polished black stones, and he had been assigned to observe the human migration as part of a cultural exchange program between his species and the humans, a program that most Delvari considered a waste of time because humans were, in the grand ranking of galactic civilizations, utterly unremarkable in almost every measurable. Their technology was decent but not extraordinary. Their military was competent but not feared. Their diplomacy was clever but not legendary. And yet something about humans made every other species in the Concord just a little bit uneasy, though nobody could quite explain why. Corus Vaughn had spent 3 weeks aboard the Hearthstone trying to understand that unease, and he had begun to form a theory. He stood now in the observation gallery above the ship's central plaza, watching a human mother chase her small son across the grass, the boy shrieking with laughter as she caught him and swung him into the air, and the sound of that laughter echoed off the metal walls and made something in the ambassador's chest tighten in a way he did not fully understand. The Delvari reproduced in clutches of several hundred, and the hatchlings were raised in communal nurseries where efficiency and survival were the primary concerns, and individual attachment between parent and child was an abstract concept. Now, Corus Vaughn's theory had begun to crystallize. Offspring was considered not just unnecessary, but biologically wasteful, a quirk that evolution had sensibly removed from their species millions of years ago. But humans were different. Humans held their children close, and whispered to them in the dark, and sang them songs, and wept when they were sick, and fought like cornered animals when they were threatened. And Corus Vaughn had watched all of this with the careful detachment of a scientist observing an alien phenomenon, until the turbulence alarm had gone off 2 days ago. It had been a minor alert, nothing dangerous, just a gravitational ripple from a nearby pulsar that had caused the ship to shudder for a few seconds. And in those few seconds, Corus Vaughn had watched every single human adult in the plaza move toward their children with a speed and coordination that looked almost military. And he had seen fathers throw themselves over strollers, and mothers pull toddlers under tables, and teachers form walls around their students with their own bodies, all of it happening in the space of a heartbeat, without a single word spoken, as if some ancient signal had fired through every human brain at once. The alarm had ended, and the humans had laughed about it, and gone back to their meals and their conversations. But Corus Vaughn had not laughed, because what he had seen was not funny, it was terrifying, and he had written in his private journal that night, "I believe I am beginning to understand why the galaxy is uneasy around humans." Tonight he stood in the grand reception hall of the Hearthstone, surrounded by diplomats and officers and representatives from a dozen species, all gathered for a formal dinner to celebrate the halfway point of the voyage, and he sipped a drink that tasted like burnt copper and watched Fleet Admiral Marin Thorne rise from her seat at the head of the table. Admiral Thorne was 63 years old, with silver hair cut short, and eyes the color of winter storms, and she moved with the calm patience of someone who had spent 4 decades in uniform and had seen enough of the galaxy to know exactly how dangerous it was. She tapped her glass, and the room fell silent. "I want to thank our guests for joining us tonight," she said, and her voice was warm and steady and carried easily across the hall. "And I want to take a moment to talk about something that I think is important for all of you to understand about humanity." She paused and looked around the room, meeting the eyes of every alien delegate, one by one. "We are a flexible species," she continued. "We negotiate trade, we compromise on borders, we bend on tariffs and treaties and territorial disputes. And we do this because we believe that cooperation is the foundation of civilization, and we are proud to be part of the Galactic Concord." Another pause, and this time her eyes grew colder. "But we have one policy that is not flexible, one line that is not negotiable, one rule that has no exceptions and no compromises and no second chances, and we call it the Lullaby Doctrine." The room was very quiet now. "The Lullaby Doctrine states this: whoever harms a human child will not regret it," she said, and she smiled, and the smile did not reach her eyes. "They will not regret it because they will not live long enough to feel regret." Corus Vaughn felt the temperature in the room drop by several degrees, though he knew that was only his imagination. The other delegates shifted in their seats, some amused, some confused, some visibly uncomfortable. And the Craxian trade minister leaned over to Corus Vaughn and whispered, "Human emotional theater, nothing more." And Corus Vaughn nodded politely but did not agree, because he had seen what happened during the turbulence alarm, and he knew that Admiral Thorne was not performing. She was promising. Later that night, Corus Vaughn filed the speech in his official report, under the heading Human Emotional Hyperbole, because that was what his superiors expected. But in his private journal he wrote something very different. "She meant every word, and if I were the kind of creature who prayed, I would pray that nobody ever tests her." Far away, in the lawless fringe of Concord space, where the light of civilization grew thin and predators roamed freely, the Vraxi hegemony was watching. The Vraxi were reptilian, cold-blooded in every sense of the word, a species that had built their empire on slavery and conquest, and had never signed the Concord Treaties, because they considered cooperation a symptom of weakness. And their intelligence operatives had been tracking the Hearthstone since it left port. They did not care about the adults. They cared about the children, specifically about the neural tissue inside human children's brains, which contained an extraordinarily rare compound that could not be synthesized in any laboratory in the known galaxy, a compound that was the key ingredient in NextWire, the most powerful cognitive enhancement drug ever created, worth more per gram than Starship fuel on the black market. Warlord Sethka, Supreme Commander of the Vraxi Third Fleet, studied the Hearthstone's trajectory on his command screen and ran his tongue across his teeth. "How many young ones aboard?" he asked. "Over 3,000, my lord," his intelligence officer replied. Sethka's eyes narrowed with cold satisfaction. "We only need 200, he said. "Prepare the boarding teams." And in the warm heart of the Hearthstone, a little girl named Lena, 4 years old with dark curls and a gap-toothed smile, slept in her mother's arms and dreamed of the stars outside her window, unaware that something terrible was moving toward her through the dark. The Hearthstone dropped out of faster-than-light travel near the Omari Straits, with a shudder that rattled coffee cups and woke sleeping babies. And the navigational officers on the bridge began their routine calculations for the next jump, while the 2 escort frigates, the Valor and the Iron Promise, took up flanking positions on either side of the colony ship, like loyal guard dogs walking beside a school bus. Captain Rhea Osmond stood on the bridge and watched the stars settle into their proper positions, and felt the familiar calm of deep space wash over her. And she turned to her tactical officer and asked for a status report, and received the answer she expected, which was that everything was quiet and normal and boring, exactly the way a captain with 3,400 children aboard wanted things to be. 7 minutes later, 14 Vraxi warships dropped out of FTL in a perfect attack formation, and the largest of them, a dreadnought-class carrier called the Fang of Sethka, was already charging its weapons before its hull had fully materialized. Captain Osman had 4 seconds to process what she was seeing before the first volley hit the Iron Promise and turned its forward section into a cloud of burning metal. All hands, battle stations, she said, and her voice did not shake, though her hands did. Signal the Valor to engage, activate colony shields, and get me a distress signal out on every frequency we have. The Valor fought like a wounded lion, its captain driving the frigate directly into the path of 3 Vraxi cruisers, and firing everything it had, buying the Hearthstone precious minutes, while the colony ship's communication officers frantically broadcast a distress call that would take hours to reach the nearest human military base. The Valor lasted 9 minutes before a Vraxi torpedo cut it in half. The Iron Promise lasted 4 minutes after that, and then the Hearthstone was alone. Ship's shields held against the first barrage, and the second, and the third, but the Vraxi were not trying to destroy the ship, because destroyed children were worthless children. So they switched to precision strikes that targeted the shield generators one by one, peeling away the Hearthstone's defenses like a predator stripping the shell from a turtle. When the shields fell, the boarding pods came. They punched through the hull in 12 places simultaneously, and Vraxi soldiers poured into the corridors of the Hearthstone like poison flooding through veins. Tall reptilian figures in black armor, with weapons designed not to kill, but to capture, because the cargo they wanted needed to be alive. What happened next was something the Vraxi had not expected. The humans fought back. Not just the security personnel, not just the handful of retired military veterans aboard, but everyone, every single adult on that ship who could lift a hand or swing a tool, throw a punch. Engineers grabbed plasma cutters and welding torches and turned maintenance equipment into weapons that burned through Vraxi armor like acid. And teachers barricaded classroom doors with desks and chairs, and stood behind those barricades with fire extinguishers and kitchen knives, and the kind of desperate fury that only comes from standing between a predator and someone else's child. A retired Marine named Elias Cade, 67 years old, with a prosthetic leg that clicked when he walked and a back that ached when it rained, heard the alarms from his cabin on Deck 9, and did not hesitate for even 1 second, before pulling his old service pistol from the lockbox under his bed and limping toward the sound of screaming. He found a corridor filled with smoke and chaos, and 6 Vraxi soldiers dragging children from a daycare center. And he shot the first one through the neck and the second one through the eye, and used the dead soldier's own weapon to kill 4 more before a squad of 9 Vraxi reinforcements came around the corner. Elias Cade killed 5 of them, before they brought him down with a neural disruptor that dropped him to the floor like a puppet with its strings cut. And even then, even with his body refusing to obey his brain, he crawled forward on his elbows, and grabbed the ankle of a Vraxi soldier, and held on with a grip that 3 of them could not break, until they stunned him a second time. In total, the humans killed 61 Vraxi soldiers during the boarding action, an astonishing number, given that the humans were civilians, armed with improvised weapons, fighting against trained military professionals in full combat gear. But the Vraxi were slavers by trade and by tradition, and they had done this many times before to many species, and they had tools designed for exactly this kind of resistance. They flooded the corridors with sedation gas that put humans to sleep in seconds. Neural disruptors to drop anyone who had managed to find a gas mask, and they moved through the ship with cold efficiency, scanning each child with handheld devices that measured the concentration of the neural compound they needed, selecting only the best candidates. When it was over, 217 children between the ages of 4 and 12 had been loaded into stasis pods aboard the Vraxi ships, their small bodies frozen in dreamless sleep. And among them was a 4-year-old girl named Lena, with dark curls and a gap-toothed smile, who had been torn from her mother's arms, while her mother screamed loud enough to rupture something in her own throat. The Vraxi left the adults alive, and this was not mercy. This was strategy. because Warlord Sethka wanted the humans to know what had happened, wanted them to feel the helplessness, wanted them to understand that their so-called lullaby doctrine was nothing but empty words from a species too soft to back them up. Sethka himself appeared on every screen aboard the Hearthstone, his scaled face twisted into something that might have been a smile on a creature capable of genuine amusement. "We have heard your little doctrine," he said, and his voice was like gravel scraping across glass. "Your offspring will fuel the next wire trade, and you will do nothing, because you are soft creatures who weep over your young. And weeping is not war." The transmission ended. The corridors of the Hearthstone were quiet now, except for the sound of crying, a sound that started as individual voices and grew into a chorus that filled every deck and every room and every corner of the broken ship, the sound of parents who had failed to protect their children, which is a sound that no species in the galaxy, no matter how alien, could mistake for anything other than what it was. Elias Cade lay on a medical stretcher, with blood running from his ears and a nurse stitching a wound on his scalp. And he stared at the ceiling with eyes that had gone completely flat and empty. And when the nurse asked him if he was all right, he did not answer the question. Instead, he said, very quietly, "They have no idea what they have just done." The nurse looked at him and saw something in his face that made her stop stitching. "Nobody takes our kids," Elias whispered, and his voice was steady and calm and absolutely terrifying. "Nobody takes our kids and gets away with it. Not once, not ever, not in the entire history of our species." 6 hours later, the fragmented distress signal from the Hearthstone reached Fort Canaan, humanity's largest military starbase, a fortress carved into an asteroid the size of a small moon, bristling with enough weapons to crack a planet. The officer who received the signal listened to it twice and then picked up a red communication device that had not been used in 47 years. The message he sent was 3 words, long: "Lullaby protocol activated." And across human space, in every colony and every station and every ship, something ancient and terrible began to wake. The news traveled through human space at the speed of light and hit every colony, every station, every outpost, and every ship like a fist to the heart. And the galaxy watched with curiosity, and then confusion, and then slowly growing horror, as something happened to humanity that no alien species had ever witnessed before. The humans went quiet. It was not the quiet of grief, though there was grief, and it was not the quiet of shock, though there was shock, and it was not the quiet of helplessness, because helplessness was something that humans simply did not feel when their children were involved. It was the quiet of a species making a decision, a single unified decision made by billions of individuals across thousands of worlds, without any debate or disagreement or hesitation, the way a heartbeat requires no discussion before it beats. The United Human Command convened an emergency session aboard Fort Canaan, and 4,200 representatives from all sectors gathered in the chamber. Every human world and colony and territory connected through quantum-linked communication channels to vote on the activation of the Lullaby Protocol, the most extreme military response in humanity's entire history. A protocol that had been designed 300 years ago and had never once been used, because no species in the galaxy had ever been foolish enough to trigger it. The session lasted 11 minutes. The vote was 4,200 in favor and 0 against, and when the result was announced, there was no applause and no speeches and no ceremony, just a cold silence that spread through the chamber, like frost spreading across glass. Fleet Admiral Naren Thorne received the authorization in her office at Fort Canaan, and read it once, and set it down on her desk, and turned every photograph of her grandchildren face down, one by one, with careful, deliberate hands, because she did not want them watching what she was about to do. Across the galaxy, alien ambassadors and diplomats and intelligence officers who monitored human affairs began to notice things that made them increasingly uncomfortable. Human trade ships that had been carrying goods between Concord worlds suddenly changed course and headed home. All of them, every single one, leaving behind confused alien trading partners and half-completed contracts, and ports full of cargo that nobody came to collect. Human-owned restaurants and shops on alien stations closed their doors without explanation, and the human workers who staffed them packed their belongings in silence and booked passage on the next transport back to human space. Factories on human colony worlds that had been producing consumer goods and luxury items and agricultural equipment shut down their assembly lines at midnight and retooled their machinery, and by morning they were producing weapons and ammunition and armor plating and combat drones with an efficiency that made alien industrial. Engineers stare at their data readouts in disbelief. And perhaps most unsettling of all, the laughter stopped. Every alien species that had spent time around humans had noticed the laughter, because humans laughed constantly, at jokes and at themselves, and at their friends, and at situations that were not funny at all. And the sound of human laughter had become one of the most recognizable sounds on any mixed-species station in the Concord. Now it was gone, replaced by something that the Delvari ambassador Corus Vaughn described in his urgent report to his government as a silence that feels like the air before a lightning strike. Corus Vaughn requested an emergency meeting with Admiral Thorne and was granted one, though he had to wait 6 hours because the Admiral was busy coordinating something that she did not explain. And when he finally entered her office, he saw the photographs turned down and the star charts spread across every surface, and the cold, flat look in her eyes that reminded him of the turbulence alarm aboard the Hearthstone, that ancient instinct. Except now it was not a momentary reflex, but a sustained state of being. "Admiral," he said carefully, "I am here as a friend of humanity, and I want to understand what is happening so that the Dalvari can respond appropriately." Thorne looked at him for a long moment. "Ambassador, I am going to be transparent with you, because the Delvari have been fair partners to us," she said. "What is about to happen is not war." "If not war, then what?" Corus Vaughn asked. "War has rules," Thorne said. "War has objectives and boundaries and conditions for surrender and negotiations, and all the civilized machinery that species use to limit the damage they do to each other." And she paused and folded her hands on the desk. "What is about to happen has none of those things. What is about to happen is a lesson." Corus Vaughn felt his forehands go cold. "Concord due to help?" he asked. "Stay out of our way," Thorne replied. "And when it is over, remember what you see, and make sure every species in this galaxy remembers it too, because I want this to be the last time we ever have to do this." Corus Vaughn left the office and immediately sent an encrypted message to the Delvari High Council with a recommendation that all Delvari ships avoid human space and Vraxi space for the foreseeable future. And he added a personal note that said simply, "I was wrong about the emotional hyperbole." Meanwhile, in Vraxi space, Warlord Sethka was throwing a feast. The 217 human children were secured in a processing facility on the Vraxi colony world of Veth Prime, and the first batches of neural compound had already been extracted from 14 of them, a procedure that the Vraxi scientists assured Sethka was not always fatal, though they admitted that younger subjects had a lower survival rate. Did not care about survival rates, because there were plenty more where these came from. His intelligence officers had briefed him on the likely human response, and had concluded that humanity would first attempt diplomatic channels, then economic sanctions, then perhaps a small rescue operation with special forces, all of which would take weeks or months to organize. More than enough time to extract what they needed and disperse the evidence. Their full military mobilization would take at least 4 months, the chief intelligence officer said confidently. They do not have the logistics for a rapid, large-scale deployment. Sethka nodded and drank deeply from his cup, and congratulated himself on his boldness. He was wrong. He was catastrophically, fundamentally, fatally wrong. because humanity had been preparing for this exact scenario since the day they first stepped into the galaxy, and realized that the universe was full of predators who might one day look at human children and see something worth taking. The Black Cradle fleet had been built in secret over the course of 150 years, hidden in classified locations scattered across the galaxy, maintained by crews who had volunteered for a lifetime of silence and isolation, in exchange for the knowledge that if the worst ever happened, they would be ready. Within 72 hours of the Lullaby Protocol activation, 342 warships emerged from hidden shipyards and secret anchorages and covert bases that no alien intelligence service had ever detected, and they converged on the border of Vraxi space like wolves gathering at the edge of a field full of sheep. Among them were 12 planet-class dreadnoughts, each one capable of rendering a world uninhabitable, and the largest of them was a ship called the HNV Motherless, named not for the state of being without a mother, but for the state of having made someone motherless. Human crews who served aboard other vessels spoke that name in low voices. Admiral Thorne stood on the bridge of the Motherless and looked at the star chart that showed the border of Vraxi space, and she thought about the photographs on her desk turned face down, and the 217 children in stasis pods, and the parents aboard the Hearthstone who were at this moment sitting in empty rooms, staring at empty beds. She opened the fleet-wide channel. "All ships," she said, and her voice was calm and steady, and carried the weight of every parent who had ever lost a child. "We cross the border in 1 hour. There will be no declaration of war. There will be no advance warning. There will be no mercy. We are bringing our children home, and we are going to make sure that nobody in this galaxy ever thinks about taking them again." 342 ships answered with a single word that echoed across the void. Acknowledged. Moved forward into the dark. The human fleet crossed into Vraxi space without ceremony and without hesitation. 342 warships moving in perfect formation through the darkness like a blade sliding silently from its sheath. And every Vraxi border station they passed received the same transmission, broadcast on every frequency, in every language the translation systems could produce. Admiral Thorne's voice filled Vraxi communication channels from one end of their territory to the other. "You have taken 217 of our children," she said. "You will return every single one of them, alive and unharmed. For every child that has been hurt, we will destroy one of your worlds. For every child that has died, we will destroy 10. This is not a negotiation. This is not a threat. This is a countdown, and it has already begun." Warlord Sethka received the transmission in his command center on Veth Prime, and listened to it with the expression of a creature who has just realized that the ground beneath his feet is not as solid as he believed. But Sethka was Vraxi, and the Vraxi did not surrender, had never surrendered in their entire history, and so he did what his nature and his pride demanded, and ordered his fleet to intercept the human invaders. 90 Vraxi warships surged forward to meet the human fleet at the Vraxi Veil, a dense nebula that marked the outer boundary of the hegemony's core territories, and Sethka watched from his command screen as the two forces converged and felt the old familiar thrill of combat rising in his cold blood. The Battle of the Vraxi Veil lasted 4 hours. In the first hour, the Vraxi fought with confidence and aggression, their ships darting through the nebula's gas clouds and firing from concealed positions, using tactics that had served them well against a dozen other species over the centuries. In the second hour, the confidence began to crack, because the humans did not fight them. Way other species fought, they did not advance in predictable patterns, or retreat when taking damage, or break formation under pressure. Instead, they moved with a cold mechanical precision that seemed almost inhuman, each ship anticipating the movements of every other ship in the fleet, as if they were all connected to a single brain. In the third hour, the Vraxi began to understand that they were not fighting a military. They were fighting something else entirely. Something that did not care about victory or glory or territorial gain. Something that had only one objective, and would accept nothing less than the complete and total destruction of everything that stood between it and that objective. In the 4th hour, it was over. Not one Vraxi warship survived. Not one escaped. Not one surrendered in time to be spared. Because the humans did not pause to accept surrenders, did not slow down to take prisoners, did not stop firing until every single Vraxi vessel was a cloud of expanding debris, drifting through the nebula like dust in a cathedral. 90 ships, gone in 4 hours. Military analysts from every species in the Galactic Concord would study the Battle of the Vraxi Veil for generations, and the thing they would find most disturbing was not the efficiency of the human fleet, or the sophistication of their tactics, or the power of their weapons. It was the silence. There were no battle cries, no triumphant shouts when enemy ships were destroyed, no celebrations when the last Vraxi vessel broke apart. Just calm voices reporting status updates and coordinates and targeting solutions. The voices of people doing a job that needed to be done, nothing more and nothing less. With the Vraxi fleet destroyed, the ground assault began. The Obsidian Marines, humanity's most elite fighting force, deployed to every Vraxi installation where intelligence indicated children might be held, dropping from orbit in armored shuttles. That punched through planetary defenses like needles through cloth. But the Marines were not alone. Alongside them came the volunteers, thousands of human civilians who had answered the call when the Lullaby Protocol was activated. Parents and teachers and doctors and engineers and shopkeepers and farmers who had never held a military weapon in their lives, but who had completed basic combat certification in 48 hours and had demanded, not asked, but demanded, to be part of the rescue force. The military commanders had tried to refuse them, and had quickly learned that refusing a human parent who wants to help rescue children is like trying to refuse the tide. Elias Cade was among them. The old Marine with the prosthetic leg and the stitched-up scalp had discharged himself from the Hearthstone's medical bay against the furious protests of every doctor aboard, and had hitched a ride on a supply transport to the staging area, to a recruitment officer half his age, and said simply, "I was there when they took them, and I will be there when we get them back." The recruitment officer had looked at this battered 67-year-old man, with blood still crusted behind his ears, and had seen something in his eyes that made arguing pointless. "Welcome aboard, sir," was all she said. The assault on Veth Prime, where the main processing facility was located, was the largest and the most brutal. The Vraxi garrison fought with the desperation of creatures who knew what was coming, but desperation was not enough against an enemy that had moved beyond anger into something colder and more absolute. The Obsidian Marines cleared the facility room by room by room, stepping over Vraxi bodies, kicking down doors, and calling out in soft voices to any children who might be hiding. "It is okay," they said, as they moved through corridors stained with smoke and blood. "We are here now. We are human. You are safe." Elias Cade limped through the facility with a plasma rifle that was almost too heavy for his tired arms, and he found 2 children in a locked storage room, a boy of 7 and a girl of 9, both unconscious but alive. And he slung the rifle across his back and picked up both children, one in each arm, and carried them out through a burning corridor, while his prosthetic leg sparked and ground against the floor, and his back screamed with pain that he did not feel, because pain was a luxury he could not afford right now. 193 children were recovered alive. 24 were not. The recovery teams found them in the processing labs, small bodies on steel tables, their skulls carefully opened, their neural tissue extracted with surgical precision by Vraxi scientists who had treated them not as children, but as raw material, as ingredients, as things. When the report reached Admiral Thorne on the bridge of Motherless, She read it in silence, and set the datapad down, and closed her eyes for 10 seconds. When she opened them again, something had changed in her face, something that the officers around her recognized and looked away from because it was too painful to see. "How many?" she asked, though she already knew. 24, Admiral." Thorn nodded once. "Read me their names," she said. And the officer read 24 names, and Thorn listened to every one. And when the last name had been spoken, she stood and addressed the fleet through the open channel. "Protocol Cradle Song," she said. 24 worlds. Nobody asked for clarification, because everybody knew what Cradle Song meant. Over the following 72 hours, the human fleet systematically destroyed 24 Vraxi colony worlds. They did not kill the populations, because humans were not murderers, and every world was given 6 hours to evacuate, and human ships assisted in the evacuation, herding millions of terrified Vraxi civilians onto refugee vessels, and guiding them to safety with the same calm efficiency they had used to destroy the Vraxi fleet. But the worlds themselves were erased. Oceans were boiled into steam that rose into atmospheres that were then stripped away by orbital bombardment. Cities were turned to glass by weapons that burned hotter than stars. Forests and fields and mountains were reduced to flat plains of fused rock that glowed orange in the darkness of space. And after each world was destroyed, the same message was broadcast across every communication channel in the galaxy. "This is for Mia Chen. She was 6 years old. This is for David Okafor. He was 8 years old. This is for Lily Vasquez. She was 4 years old. 24 names, 24 ages, 24 worlds." The galaxy listened in stunned silence. Warlord Sethka was captured alive on the 3rd day, pulled from a bunker beneath his command center by Obsidian Marines, who handled him with great care, because their orders were very specific about what was to happen to him. He was not executed. He was placed in a transparent cell at the center of Fort Canaan, a cell that was climate-controlled and furnished with everything Vraxi needed to survive in reasonable comfort. And surrounding this cell on all 4 walls, and on the ceiling, and on the floor, were holographic displays that played the names and faces and recorded laughter of the 24 children who had died. The displays played continuously, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They would never stop. Sethka would live out his natural life in that cell, fed and watered and kept in good health, listening to the laughter of the children he had killed, and he would never know silence again for as long as he breathed. When the last Vraxi world had been destroyed, and the last child had been returned to human arms, Admiral Thorn sat alone in her office and turned her grandchildren's photographs face up again, one by one. Then she put her head in her hands and wept, because the job was done, and she could finally afford to feel what she had been holding back since the moment she first heard the words, "Lullaby Protocol activated." 6 months after the Vraxi campaign, the galaxy was still trembling. The Vraxi hegemony had collapsed, not only from the military devastation, but from the shockwave of fear and shame that had rippled through its territories like a crack spreading through ice. The vassal species that had served the Vraxi for generations, species that had been too afraid to resist for centuries, looked at what the humans had done and realized that the monster they had feared was not so monstrous after all. One by one, they rose up and declared their independence. The Vraxi, who had once ruled 100 worlds, found themselves confined to a handful of barren core systems, impoverished and isolated, and surrounded by former slaves who no longer feared them. The Galactic Concord called an emergency summit on the neutral station of Thessera Prime, and representatives from all 34 member species gathered in the great amphitheater to discuss what had happened and what it meant, and what should be done about the species that had just demonstrated, in terms that left no room for misinterpretation, exactly what it was capable of. The mood in the chamber was complicated. Some species were terrified and wanted humanity sanctioned and contained and monitored. and they spoke about the destruction of 24 worlds as if it were an act of barbarism that proved humans were too dangerous to be trusted with a seat at the galactic table. Others were quietly grateful because the Vraxi had been a threat to everyone for centuries, and nobody else had ever had the courage or the capability to do anything about it. And these species said nothing in public, but sent private messages to the human delegation, expressing their admiration and their relief. And some, like the Delvari, were simply trying to understand. Ambassador Chorus Vaughn requested the floor on the third day of the summit, and when his turn came, he walked to the center of the room, amphitheater on his long insectoid legs, and looked out at the assembled representatives of 34 species, and took a deep breath. "I have studied humans for 40 years, he began. "I have lived among them, and eaten their food, and listened to their music, and watched their children play. And I have spent most of those 40 years trying to categorize them, trying to fit them into the frameworks that we use to understand other species, and I have failed every single time." He paused and activated a holographic display, and the chamber filled with images he had recorded aboard the Hearthstone. Images of human parents holding their children, of mothers singing lullabies, of fathers carrying sleeping toddlers on their shoulders, of teachers reading stories to rooms full of small, attentive faces. "This is what humans look like when their children are safe," he said. He changed the display, and now the chamber was filled with the sounds he had recorded after the kidnapping, the screaming and the weeping, and then the terrible silence that had followed, and several delegates shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "This is what humans sound like when their children are taken," he said. He changed the display one more time, and now the chamber saw the fleet, 342 warships moving through space in perfect formation, and the battle of the Vraxi Vale, and the Obsidian Marines kicking down doors, and the 24 worlds burning. "And this is what humans do when their children are harmed," he said. He let the silence hang for a long moment before he continued. "Some of you want to sanction them," he said. "Some of you want to build bigger fleets and stronger defenses against them, and I understand that impulse, because what we witnessed was indeed frightening. But I want you to consider something before you act on that fear." He looked directly at the Craxian delegation, who had been the most vocal in calling for sanctions. "The humans did not start this," he said. "They did not invade Vraxi space for territory or resources or power. They did not attack unprovoked. They did not choose violence as a first option, or a second option, or a third option. What they did was respond to the kidnapping and murder of their children with exactly the force they had always promised they would use, a promise that they made publicly and repeatedly, and that the Vraxi chose to ignore." He straightened to his full height. "I have reached a conclusion about humans," he said, "and I want every species in this chamber to hear it clearly. They are not warlike, they are not aggressive, they are not cruel. They are in fact one of the most cooperative and gentle and generous species in this Concord, and any of you who have spent time among them know this to be true. But they have a line, and the line is their children. Cross that line, and you are not dealing with diplomats or soldiers or politicians. You are dealing with something far older and far deeper, something that existed in humans long before they built their first fire or carved their first tool, something that is encoded in their very biology, in the structure of their brains, in the chemistry of their blood. The humans have a word for it," Chorus Vaughn said. "They call it parenthood, and I have come to believe that it is the most powerful force in this galaxy, more powerful than any weapon or any fleet or any empire, because empires can be reasoned with, and fleets can be outmaneuvered, and weapons can be countered. But a parent protecting their child cannot be stopped, cannot be bargained with, cannot be frightened into submission, and will never ever ever give up." The chamber was silent for a very long time. The vote to sanction humanity failed by a wide margin. Instead, the Concord passed a new resolution, proposed by the Delvari, and co-sponsored by 18 other species, formally recognizing the Lullaby Doctrine as a legitimate defensive policy, and adding a new clause to the Galactic Concord Charter that specifically prohibited the targeting of any species young as an act of war or commerce. It was called the Hearthstone Amendment, and it was adopted unanimously. Far from the halls of power and the debates of diplomats, the GSS Hearthstone continued its journey toward the Valen Reach. The ship had been repaired and refitted, and its corridors were filled once again with the sounds of life, though those sounds were softer now, more careful, as if the ship itself was still healing from what had happened within its walls. A memorial wall had been installed in the central plaza, a wall of polished black stone, engraved with 24 names, and every human who walked past it reached out and touched it, not because anyone had told them to, but because it was the kind of thing that humans simply did. Make contact with the memory of lost children, to say with the tips of their fingers what words could not express. Elias Cade sat in the ship's garden beneath a tree that grew in artificial sunlight, and read a story aloud to a group of children who sat cross-legged on the grass around him, their faces turned up toward his, like flowers turned toward the sun, and his voice was warm and steady and gentle in a way that nobody who had seen him fight aboard the Vraxi facility would have believed possible. A small girl named Lena, 4 years old with dark curls, and a gap-toothed smile that was slowly returning to her face after months of silence, climbed into his lap and leaned her head against his chest, and listened to the rumble of his voice through his ribcage. When the story was over, she looked up at him with serious eyes. "Are the bad aliens going to come back?" she asked. Elias looked out the window at the stars that drifted past like scattered diamonds. He thought about the fleet and the fire, and the 24 worlds that now existed only as fields of glass and memory. And he thought about the look in Admiral Thorne's eyes, and the sound of 342 ships answering as one. "No, sweetheart," he said. "They will not." "How do you know?" Lena asked. He smiled down at her, and the smile was real and warm, and it reached all the way to his eyes. "Because the whole galaxy just learned something," he said. "What did they learn?" "That you do not mess with somebody's kids." Lena considered this with the gravity that only a 4-year-old could bring to bear on a subject. Then she nodded as if this made perfect sense, and settled deeper into his lap, and asked him to read another story. He did. In a distant corner of the galaxy, far from the warmth of the Hearthstone's garden, a young Vraxi officer stood at his post aboard a border patrol station that was one of the last remaining outposts of what had once been a mighty empire, and he watched his sensor screen with the nervous attention of a creature that had learned the hard way what happened when you failed to pay attention to the things moving through your space. A blip appeared on his screen. It was a human cargo ship, unescorted, traveling at a leisurely pace through what was technically still Vraxi territory, and according to its manifest, it was carrying agricultural supplies and a school group on an educational field trip. The young officer turned to his superior, a scarred veteran who had survived the Battle of the Vraxi Vale by the simple luck of having been on leave when it happened. "Sir, a human vessel is in our space without authorization. Should we?" The superior glanced at the screen and went pale beneath his scales. "Let them pass," he said immediately. "But sir, they are in our territory without—" "I said let them pass." The young officer opened his mouth, then closed it again, and with a nod, returned to his station. His mouth, to protest, and then closed it again when he saw the look on his superior's face, a look that said some arguments were not worth having, and some lessons only needed to be learned once. The cargo ship drifted past the station, unhurried and unafraid, and the young officer watched it go and noticed something on its hull, something painted in bright, uneven strokes that could only have been made by small hands. It was a mural of stars and moons and smiling faces, painted in every color imaginable. And beneath the mural, written in every major galactic language, in letters that wobbled and wandered the way children's writing always does, was a single line: "We are someone's children." The young officer stared at those words for a long time after the ship had passed, and he understood them in a way that went deeper than language, deeper than culture, deeper than the vast gulf between his species and the small, strange creatures who had painted them. Understood that those words were not a statement, they were a warning, and the galaxy would remember it forever.